Hi everyone, I see you. Chapter 10, Lesson 3. Mrs. Davenport's giving me a funny look right now. I think she feels like I'm a little creepy. I'm not creepy, am I? How about now? Our essential questions here, of course, for Chapter 10, Lesson 3 is, can the government fix the economy? And we're going to see a bunch of different answers to this. We're going to see that the government can and can't fix the economy depending on what it chooses to do and when it chooses to do it. So we're picking up here at the beginning of Roosevelt's second term in 1936, and we're going to carry this all the way up to the beginning of his third term in 1940. And this is going to see really the last of the New Deals and the approach for America, at least domestically, of World War II. Now, we know that from previous lessons that the Supreme Court was not a fan of the New Deal at all. It just didn't like it. It ruled a couple of different programs unconstitutional. And as I'm blowing up here on the screen, you can see that in 1936, the spring of 1937, when Roosevelt begins his second term after being elected in 36, the Supreme Court is consisting of 9 different justices, and it's a 5-4 split, and there are 5 conservative Republicans and there are 4 liberal Democrats. So anytime we're going to see New Deal legislation go before the Supreme Court to see if it is or if it isn't constitutional, chances are Supreme Court is going to say, not so much, it's unconstitutional. Roosevelt is really worried about this as his second term starts because the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act are 2 different programs that he has put forward that are going to be up for cases in front of the Supreme Court. And you can see them listed right here at the top of the slide. So Roosevelt, realizing that his programs are going to be under fire and perhaps not even permitted under law because of the Supreme Court, he decides to attack the Supreme Court. And he feels like he can do this because he won so strongly in 1936 with the help of his New Deal coalition. He proposes in the spring of 1937 something that we're going to call a court packing bill. And here's the concept of the court packing. Imagine you've got a paper bag, right? And you've filled it with marshmallows. And it's just about all the way filled with marshmallows. But you don't like those marshmallows. Half of those marshmallows, slightly more than half of those marshmallows, they just, they're out to choke you. They want to go in your mouth and choke you, and you don't want to choke on them. So what you're going to do is you're going to stuff as many more marshmallows into that bag that do like you that you can eat. That's the concept. We've got 5 justices on the Supreme Court that don't like the New Deal, that have struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, that have struck down other acts as well, like the National Recovery Act. And we need to find a way to stuff some more friendly liberal Democrat judges onto the Supreme Court so that the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act can stay legal in our country. What happens? Roosevelt's plan that he sends says that he could, in essence, appoint up to 6 more justices every time one of the ones already on the court, up here, turns 70 and don't retire. So that you could conceivably see a Supreme Court made up of a ton of people. Right? I mean, you have 9, you add 6, you get 15. We could see a Supreme Court of 15 justices, and a lot of them, because they'd owe their appointments to Franklin Roosevelt, would be more likely to support his New Deal programs. That's the idea. An overwhelmingly liberal Supreme Court that would support Roosevelt. This is a really, really, really bad idea, in part because we don't know who those new justices would be. What happens if some of those new justices might be, according to what white segregationists feared anyway, people that might want to end segregation? Or what if African Americans feared they turned out to be justices that would decide to turn against any civil rights and support Jim Crow and segregation. In other words, nobody knows for sure who would be appointed to this thing, and everyone who's a part of the New Deal coalition, white, black alike, worries that the judges that would be appointed would be against them. So it doesn't necessarily work in Roosevelt's favor. The results are that, for whatever reason, the justices decide to switch their votes. That 5-4 Supreme Court that had been voting against New Deal programs feels a little threatened, changes their votes, and now all of a sudden it's 5-4 for New Deal programs. So while Roosevelt definitely sees his reputation hurt by this, and it does help Republicans and conservatives gain some strength against Roosevelt, he does get what he wants. The Social Security Act and the Wagner Act are upheld by the courts. There is some switch over from conservative to liberals. And even though the bill doesn't pass, Roosevelt still kind of gets what he wants. And even with the Republicans and the conservatives gaining some strength off of this because people were worried that Roosevelt might have too much power, that Roosevelt might be influencing the court too much, he's still going to have a chance to make some changes because of something else that happens in 1937. And that something is going to be the recession of 1937. So if we take a step back here as we're getting ready to look at this next slide, what we can see here is, can the government fix the economy, and not when it tries to circumvent the Constitution, right? So no. Essentially, Roosevelt wants to pack the court to make it friendly to his presidency. You can't do that. It's against the rules. So he's not able to do that. And the only reason he's able to continue being popular and continue getting New Deal programs across is because of this recession of 1937. What happens here is that Roosevelt, in 1936, we're going to see him raise taxes and try and cut spending in an attempt to kind of take the government out of the economy a little bit, dial it back, a little less government in the economy, a little more laissez-faire. And the reaction there is going to be people having less to spend. And we know how difficult that can be. If the government takes away the jobs that it creates with the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the WPA, or any of the programs that we talked about, well, then they have to get a job in private business. And there's just not enough people hiring right yet in private business to really put all these Americans back to work. So what happens is when Roosevelt tries to cut his deficit spending, he's going to raise taxes to do that for Social Security. He's going to cut spending. But unfortunately, he cuts it too much and raises it too much, which is going to lead to unemployment. And you can see that here, right? Unemployment goes up, 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 up. Peaks in 1933, right? The winter of 1932-33. And then it falls as the government employs people. We hit 1937. Roosevelt cuts spending. We're not going to hire as many Americans for government programs anymore, and we're going to raise taxes for Social Security, and then whoop, unemployment heads back up. This is the recession of 1937. And Roosevelt is going to say, well, time out, 30 seconds. Clearly the country isn't ready for the government to totally be out of the economy yet. We're not ready for laissez-faire economies. We may never be, according to Roosevelt. So he's going to look for a group of people that he can target to help, and he's going to focus on those that are particularly impoverished, the poor of the poor. So while we see that the government does have a tough time helping and fixing the economy when it raises taxes too much or when it cuts spending at the wrong time, we are going to see Roosevelt be able to bounce back and help the economy when he focuses on the poorest of the poor Americans, particularly those Americans who are impoverished in the South and who are African American, who we know aren't doing as well as whites. So two laws are going to be passed here, two things he's going to do to help them. One of them is going to be the Farm Security Administration, and essentially this helps both poor white Southerners and black sharecroppers. What it does is it gives those folks loans. So if you're a tenant farmer, if you're a sharecropper, you can get a loan to purchase your own farm. That's a big deal because it's really going to help poor African Americans and poor whites in the South get the loans they need to get off the land that they're renting and start to make some of their own money and keep some of that profit for themselves and not sell it and give it off as rent. The other thing that's going to start here is going to be the Fair Labor Standards Act, which does abolish child labor finally, fully, completely in some jobs. And it establishes an 8-hour workday and getting paid time and a half for overtime. And it even establishes something that we'll take a look at as we go forward in class, the minimum wage. But it also helps, as you can see, right, the poorest of the poor. This is going to help poor whites, it's going to help Native Americans, it's going to help poor blacks, it's going to help poor Hispanics, it's going to help factory workers, it's going to help farmers. It helps all kinds of people, men, women. Everyone benefits from the Fair Labor Standards Act. So what we're going to see here with these two programs is that Roosevelt is going to be able to get those Americans back to work. And you can see that by 1938, after these two major laws are passed, we're going to see unemployment return to its decline all the way to 1943 when it's well below 5%. So this is going to bring us to the very end of the New Deal era. These last New Deal reforms are going to come to a close in 1939, in part because of World War II, but also because Republicans and other conservative Democrats are really going to be blocking any other New Deal legislation to come through. What they've done here, and what Roosevelt has done, is he's rescued the country. And essentially what conservatives and Democrats are going to be saying in the South, especially white Southern Democrats, is that it's time to dial it back. It's time to stop helping the government or the economy through the government. We need to find a way to prevent ourselves from getting too close to, say, socialism. The other thing I want to point out here is that the Farm Security Administration is particularly successful, almost too successful, in that it helps a good number of African Americans. That's why you see Republicans and white Southern Democrats teaming up. Essentially, you take all those people that were a part of the New Deal coalition and you break them up a little bit and you say, there's some cracks beginning to form here. White Southern Democrats getting angry at the presence of African Americans in that coalition. We don't want to help them too much, at least in their mind. So where does this leave us then at the end of the 1930s as the Great Depression is beginning to come to a close? It really leaves us with a heck of a legacy. The federal government now has basically said, you know what, laissez-faire, we're not doing it anymore, not completely. We're going to try and kind of almost go back to that common sense Teddy Roosevelt square deal by making sure there's some regulation within the economy so people don't get hurt too much, so that things can't race out of control too much. There's going to be that attempt. There will be problems along the way about making that happen, like there was in the 1990s and 2000s leading up to the Great Recession. But for the most part, America's not going to be as laissez-faire loving as it was in the Second Industrial Revolution and Gilded Age and in the 1920s. The other thing then is that since the government's now kind of this broker state that kind of regulates the conflict between people and business, it's also going to have safety nets that it's put in place, safety nets that people aren't going to want to lose, right? I mean, if I have Social Security and if I have access to low-income housing and homeowners loans and all these other cool things that the government brought in the New Deal, why would I want to give that up, like, ever? So America's now going to see itself arguing not about whether the government should provide a safety net, but how much of a safety net the government should provide. Should it be a or should it be a really, really big one? And I think there's one last legacy to mention too, which is that with the New Deal, under the New Deal, public works stretch from coast to coast. This is a map, and it's only a partial map, of almost 11,000 New Deal projects coast to coast. Whether you're a fan of government regulation and intervention in the economy during tough times, or whether you're a fan of laissez-faire, you can't deny that modern America, where we live now, is the result of the government building our country, our modern country, during the 1930s New Deal Depression era. So much of what we are and who we are things that we drive on, drive over, drive in, learn in, get healed in. All these things come about in part because of the New Deal and government spending. So it certainly creates a long-lasting legacy that we see every time we're outside. We'll talk more about this in class tomorrow, and that's the end of chapter